Hi everyone, my name is Taryn with Quest and welcome to our third day of our JD Edwards Week, part of our Quest Forum digital event. So today our presentation is Orchestrator Tech Tips and our speaker is Frank Jordan with ERP Suites. So a few housekeeping notes to go over before we get started. All attending lines are in mute and will stay in mute throughout this session. If you do have any questions, please feel free to put those into the question drop-down box. We will answer those at the end of today's session, and this is being recorded and it will be on the Quest content library at a later date, but right now it's available on demand on our go-to stage. So at this time, I'm going to hand it over to Frank, who will kick things off.
Thank you, Taryn. Well, good afternoon, morning, or evening for some of you out there. I'm trying to get used to a little bit of the digital format here. But again, my name is Frank Jordan. I'm with ERP Suites, and welcome to Orchestrator Tech Tips. I'll try to make sure, hopefully, there's not background noise or any of those type of things for the recording, and hope that internet stays up nice and neat. Okay, so start this off. General agenda. We'll go through the general orchestration EnterpriseOne architectures, the studio install. Luckily, now with the new tools, we'll talk about that. It's getting much more simpler than it used to be years ago. Some of the features and tips, also tips for orchestrations, quick summary, and then if we've got some time, we'll do a demo as well. So the demo, I've got up to 3 different areas that I can show, and then we'll have the questions at the tail end. The other thing, though, just as a former customer and also JD Edwards employee, just wanted to recognize the passing of one of the founders, of Ed McVaney, the Ed of JD Edwards. He'd meant a lot to me personally as a customer. Did some things that brought me into JD Edwards back in 1996. So I guess I'm one of those old timers, but just wanted to recognize that. Alrighty. So in this, borrowing a slide here, where does all the EnterpriseOne come from and the architecture and everything else? Borrowed AJ Schifano's slide, which I really like this one. Everything is in, the magic is in the application interface services, the AIS server. So the orchestrator is used to create that, and then that talks to your JD Edwards applications, which runs your logic and the data that you have. And you have a lot of different type of areas here where you can have the UX1 interface that uses it. You can create either the JD Edwards mobile apps, which you'll probably be hearing this week, that the ones that are going out there are going to go away, and you'll have either vendor solutions or create your own mobile apps. That's one of the announcements that's coming out this week. You can have IoT devices, Internet of Things. You can connect to the cloud. You can make REST calls to other systems. You can do your own. You can use whatever type of program, like if you know Visual Basic, you can use that, or Excel, curl, Linux, Python, all types of programming languages, anything that can handle a REST interface. That's what makes this so powerful. And what it all brings you to is, again, the point of it's a gold mine of data and logic that you have in your systems, and that can feed your digital economy. So there are a number of architectures that you can do with AIS. Again, there's a lot of flexibility, and a lot of times we actually may have a couple different takes on the architecture, depending on the size, the volume, and so forth. Generally, what you're going to have here is for production for this AIS server down here, we're going to want to have it so that it's talking to its own HTML server. And then you have your main one for your web users. And if they have any AIS calls, you can have it go to it. And then optionally, if you do take advantage of any of the ADF applications, the 10 or so that's out there, it could talk to that as well, which ADF talks to AIS in that particular case. So we'll emphasize this a little bit, but the main reason, again, down in a dev and a POI, we'll talk about it here in a moment, but the main part of the architecture here is when you initiate an AIS request, it is on your behalf talking to an HTML server, JAS server. It can go in and point back to the same, but that'll double your sessions on there, which again, on a dev machine web server like that, it's probably not that big a deal. But again, if you had production and you already have 50 to 100 users in that web instance, you could essentially double that. And so that might cause you some, just some situations there, some opportunities for tuning. So that's why we recommend splitting them out, at least for the production type architectures. So general guidelines on that. What we've got here, again, if your development prototype, if you've got maybe 10 to 20 user sessions in those web instances, you can go ahead and point AIS back to that same JAS HTML instance. Again, you'll see it double up when that happens. And as I pointed out just previously, when you do that, AIS is going to talk to some JAS HTML because it's doing form service requests or data service requests and so forth. And then it can even go even larger. If you have ADF, then you might triple your web sessions because the ADF is also making an AIS call, which is going to talk to another JAS server. So the other thing that can happen with this is, depending on the type of orchestrations, you might need multiple AIS JAS pairs. So if you use UX1 or the task or EnterpriseOne search, there's a lot more activity there for it to pull up those graphs or for any of the the task or E1 searches that you're doing. So if you use that extensively, you might decide for my users web instance, I want a dedicated AIS secondary JAS server for that activity. Then if you also, let's say we've got some customers that have several hundred mobility users out there, you may want to go ahead and have a separate AIS JAS instance for that, along with different timeouts. Maybe your regular web timeout is, say, an hour or so, or 90 minutes, something in that range. Well, on mobile, you usually don't want it to last quite that long as far as inactivity. So a lot of times we'll go and set those down to somewhere between 10 and 20 minutes. Do not recommend going down below 10 minutes though. Just as a quick tidbit on that, like WebSphere and some of the timeouts are not exactly like WebLogic. If you set a timeout at 10 minutes, usually that session will end right within 10 minutes. WebSphere, on the other hand, that's more a guideline. So you might see it go in 10 minutes. You might see it take 15 minutes. So try not to go aggressively below that 10-minute mark, because there are other timeouts within E1 that might be affected negatively by that. Another area is heavy orchestration usage, such as IoT requests. If you've got large transaction volumes, a lot of scheduled jobs, maybe you need to have a dedicated orchestration server for those type of things. And another area that we definitely have seen, notifications watch list. If you start letting everybody, hundreds of users using notification watch lists, you might need some of those instances to go to another AIS JAS instance. Again, it just depends on what functionality and features you're taking care of there. The other small tidbit is if you're using the AIS scheduler, the orchestration scheduler that's included in the later tools, the 9224X, 923, and 924 releases, that will use a little bit more memory CPU to launch those orchestrations. So you might have to bump up the resources there. So before I take it a little bit further, one thing I'd like to do, usually this is the hard part here, but since we're all virtual, one of the things I'd like to do is potentially see if I'm going to share this out. I want just to get a quick poll to have you guys go here to www.menti.com, and if you use this code, You can choose one of these four choices just to give me a kind of a high level of the tools. This is my first time using this one, so we'll see if this works or not. But basically, I want to give about a minute or so, and thank you very much. I want to know kind of where the tools are at. So as an example, if some of you that are on this call and you're on XE ERP8 and 8.9 or through 8.12 releases, sorry that one person there. You're going to be a good candidate where you might want to think about getting an upgrade down the road, because unfortunately this functionality is not there yet. It's not going to, I shouldn't say yet, it's not there in those older releases. Basically your sweet spot is there on the right hand side where you're in that 9.2x range. Ideally, if you're really getting heavy into orchestrations, you'll be wanting to migrate yourself into that 9.2.4. But the 9.2.1, 9.2.2, 9.2.3, as we can see here, you've got a lot of the orchestration capabilities in there. It just depends, again, what you're wanting to use. What you may find out is that some of you here that are in this range, you'll want to do something, you'll do these things, and you'll find out, oops, I have to either do a workaround or that functionality is in this tool's release over here. That's almost becoming a running joke at times. So it's one of the fun things, it's that new feature, that new way of doing something is that's in the next one. Just like, as a matter of fact, Tools 9.2.4.4 came out, released last night. So those are that were on the latest and greatest 9.2.4.3 tools. Now there's a web maintenance pack out, so it's a little bit less effort than a full tools, but you could be considering that. All right, well, thank you guys. At least now I know where my audience is, and a lot of these things that we're talking about will pertain to you, and then some of the tips that I have where something is maybe you're running into it a little bit later here in the presentation, I'll say you may run into this if you're on the lower tools, and this now is fixed in like 9.2.3 or 9.2.4. That'll help you there. All right, so let's go back to our slideshow. And go on right over to the next. Okay, so one of the things, I think more and more people are realizing this, but the Studio is, I consider it a development tool. So you typically want to be using it down in like your DV environment and really perhaps prototype, but don't be creating new orchestrations on the fly in production. This is kind of like code is what you're doing. It's a user-defined object, a UDO, but technically you're going to want to have some kind of change management, some promotion strategy. The beauty of UDOs that I've got on the second bullet point there is, the great thing about it is these don't have to have a package build and deployment. The execution speed is dramatically faster of getting your change in so that you can test it, verify it, and then implement it. The other nice thing about, again, you're going to hear me, I'm going to sound probably like a broken record, but the reason is the Tools 9.2.4x that was released back in last November, one of the fortunate things, ERP Suites was selected along with one of our customers to be one of the beta testers. I think there was maybe 3 or 4 customers and 3 business partners that went through the beta to be able to evaluate the new functionality. And one of the really big ones there is the Orchestrator Studio is now part of AIS, so that you don't have to have a separate, what we call the classic Orchestrator Studio. There's only a couple scenarios now where you need the classic Orchestrator Studio, such as you have old orchestrations like version 1, version 2, and you want to edit them, but you don't want to yet migrate them to the new version 3 Orchestrator format that we'll talk about, or orchestration format, excuse me. One of the things about it is also scalability. You know, I've only run into maybe one customer so far that had more than 20 people trying to use the classic Orchestrator Studio, but it generally can handle about that server, depending on the size and so forth. The instance can handle about 20 to 30 users by default. There are some instances here where you can bump that up if you want to, and I put that in there. Again, with Tools 924X, we don't need this ADF instance anymore. That's a special WebLogic instance, and you won't have to deal with that. One of the things, just kind of a little bit of history, is back in the 921 days of the studio, you actually didn't have Server Manager even install it. So, you know, if you were doing some of these older studio installs, let's say you're on one of the older tools releases, you know, let's say you are on 921, you have the ADF install, and a lot of it was manual. So that also took more time to be able to do that. There was more steps. So this is an outline of that where you can kind of see the history where you did that. Server Manager definitely helped a lot with this. That was one of the beauties of this, is that, again, Orchestrator over the years it used to be version 1, it was manual XML files, and we got the Classic Studio, which made it easier than that, but it was still a manual install with ADF, using a bunch of script files to do that. Then they added it in the 921 or 922, I think I've got on the next slide, but they added it so that you could do it from Server Manager, which simplified the install quite a bit as well. There we go. So to use Server Manager, you had to be on 921.2. So if you were 921.1 or earlier, you have manual processes that you had to do that. But you can still download these classic Studio versions depending on the tools release you're at. The other component is with any of these tools is to make sure that you get the subsequent for your release, you know, like perhaps release 9.2, you've got your planner issue, you got a tools issue, there's what's called automated special instructions, and in a lot of cases there's also some UDO components like certain pages or things like that, depending on the functionality levels that you're using. From a quick high level, again, for the CNCs to help you guys out and gals, you need to be using WebLogic 12.2.1x, and this is what's called the Fusion middleware infrastructure level for the ADF. Again, this is for the pre-924 tools to do that. And what that includes is in the 12.1.2.x, I know this is a numbers game, I apologize, but it includes what's called an ADF foundation for Studio. And that's also used by some of the other E1 ADF instances. One thing though that, oops, sorry about that. Let's go back there real quick. I got a little click at me. One of the things that some people are not always aware of is that, you know, they have this concept, what's called a web maintenance pack strategy. So let's say again that you're on 9.2.2.1 and there's some functionality. An example would be maybe you wanted the AIS scheduler. Well, that didn't come out till 9.2.2.4. One of the things you can do is you can take the web maintenance pack within that tools level, and you don't have to touch your enterprise servers and your deployment server, but you can install the JAS, AIS, and Server Manager update and bring yourself up to 9.2.2.7. So it's a way of having less impact on your testing and some of the scope of the functionality. Of course, the other thing you can do if you do have a project is maybe you wanted to go to 924X, you know, but again, that's a different project there. And then the other thing to remember is the Server Manager agent. Once you start getting up into these upper tools levels, the 923s, the 924s, is a lot of times you'll also have to have a Visual Studio 2017, the x86 and the x64 runtimes if you're running these things on Windows platforms. Okay, one of the big things, again, this is where it's getting easier and easier, is the sequence of the install and configure steps, especially with the ADF server. that it takes some time to get the documentation, lay out a plan, set up that server, and so forth. So if you have not actually ever installed AIS in the studio, I would strongly recommend trying to go to 924X because it's just going to make your life so much easier with, again, one less server instance because you won't have to have ADF or any of that, and a lot less complexity. But if you do have the Fusion middleware, again, I've got some points here on what you need to do with that. Couple things again on architecture. If you're dev or PY, you can point your AIS back to your existing dev or PY JAS instance, and that should be fine in a lot of situations. Again, if you're doing production, consider having a separate one for that AIS to go to a specific JAS so that it's paired up with it. One of the things with that is the default when it gets delivered is usually about 256 meg, what we call the Java min-max settings. So in that particular web instance, the 256 will work well for, a few hundred orchestrations, things like that. If you start doing more and more though, or you start doing notifications or the scheduler, things like that, you may want to bump it up to 512 meg or, a gigabyte or 1024M. Apologize for that. But, the bulk of the work is happening over on the HTML side. But there are some things, again, if you're returning a lot of data or you have a lot of output mappings, manipulation, something we'll talk about here in a moment, Groovy, those type of things, or the scheduler, those are going to require more memory. So you'll need to bump it up. I mean, we've had some cases where, someone's returning, thousands and, well, in some cases they're trying to return even more than thousands of records. So the JSON coming back is megabytes, tens of megabytes or hundreds of megabytes in size. You might even need the AIS instance even larger than that. I've got some where we've gone up to 2 gig and a few rare cases even 4 gig. So it's not out of the realm to have to consider that. Like I said, the server manager install Orchestrator Studio is real simple. It's when you install AIS on 9.2, sorry, I said that wrong. Basically, when you get to tools 9.2.1.4 or later, you can use server manager and install that. And then you've got your classic Orchestrator. I apologize for getting myself mixed up there a little bit. But the bottom line is you want to be on one of these WebLogic 12.2.1x's for these earlier ones. The 12.2.1.3 is what I call kind of a sweet spot. It's got a lot of the fixes, the patches, and everything. Also, most of the known issues are there. Then down to this point, sorry, I jumped ahead a little bit, but again, the studio is included with AIS, and there's a really nice guide and a couple doc IDs here. And you also have security that you can define. So in the earlier releases, you had to create what's called an access list. You had to put what E1 user could actually use the studio. Now they've integrated it with the E1 security, which makes this a whole lot easier. And I'll again refer back to documentation, and this stuff is changing all the time, but learn JDE, the E1 docs, as they put out new tools, those online documents get updated, and definitely my Oracle support. They do a really good job of keeping articles and support docs and the information center updated. So a high level, again, this doc is almost like a little Bible for me, but if you want to see all the history of the Orchestrator Studio, what's changed, and this one just probably got updated today since we have 9.2.4.4 that just got released with some of the changes going in there. But it'll let you know, again, what some of the feature functionality came out with it. The part about, again, with 9.2.4 that you don't have to have ADF servers. You can also now, with AIS Studio for the first time in 9.2.4, you can run it either on WebLogic or it can run on WebSphere application server. So that's another, bonus that you get out of this. Whereas before, again, ADF was WebLogic only for that particular server. You could still have WebSphere for the other servers, the other instances such as AISIJAS, but you couldn't have Studio that way. The only other caveat here is Internet Explorer IE11. It's not supported with Studio, the new Studio in Tools 924, so you have to use Chrome or Firefox. Just a little tidbit there. And again, they do have the Classic, and what they designated it was as Orchestrator 8. And what that is mainly is if you have to maintain older orchestrations in the older formats that you have not converted to the version 3 level, you can use the Classic to do that. You can view them in the new Studio, but that's it. You can't change them. You either have to upgrade them to the version 3 format or you have to do that. And then just to go through this, again, a lot of this is in this particular doc ID right here. So the 2104912. So I'm just going to pop through these pretty quickly. And then we get down to where the Classic goes down to 61X. And then what's happened is after this, these levels you can't download unless you might be able to put in a request to Oracle support, but they're not available out there on the Update Center. But again, just to give you a little bit on when certain things were introduced, I'm not going to go through all those. The other one, though, it's really powerful. I know that here at the digital event this week, there's been some sessions on it. Definitely suggest that you go through those. But notifications, it's again, this is another slide that AJ Schifano's put out, but it provides a nice way of monitoring for exceptions or information so that you don't have to go keep doing it yourself. Let a notification orchestration check that information for you, have a watch list, but maybe you're not at your desk where you want to see, the watch list. Well, you can have a notification come in and send you a message. So this is definitely something to be considering there. Again, notifications, though, it came out in Tools 922X and upwards. To reinforce the point, it's really good for providing alerts and messages when some type of data event or activity is occurring. I really like this doc ID of the 2310804. It has some nice getting started information, good place to get familiar with it. And again, from an application standpoint, I'm a CNC, so I don't have very good application skills. But it's really nice where you could have certain notifications set up or watch list alerts if you have watch lists available to you, like a low inventory, or maybe someone has put a purchase order in and it's over $2 million. So you might want somebody to go look at that. From my technology standpoint, I've got a watch list set up, notification if we get batch jobs go into error over a certain threshold. Couple little things though, where it's had some problems. There are some where this is getting fixed. It just depends on where you're at in the tools. But if you had some special characters in the message body of the notification, like a $sign or a backslash, it could have some problems with that. Some customers, if they have the global node configuration, they change it around. Sometimes notifications wouldn't work. Again, this is another reference where the scheduler doesn't run it. So this doc ID gives you some information on there. And then I just listed off another one that I found useful in the past. Maybe save you a little bit of time searching. Another really useful feature is Groovy. As a matter of fact, yesterday, Larry Farino had a really good session on it. This is more of a development tool, but it extends the feature functionality. If you really can't do something with Orchestrator itself, which a lot of times, with the forms and the data services and everything, you can get probably about 90–95% of the time, the Studio will do it. And if it doesn't, make sure you put an enhancement request in either through Quest or through the Oracle support. But this will let you take it even further from a programmatic approach. And Groovy essentially is like a superset or of Java. So it uses a lot of the Java classes and so forth and includes it, but it's a more dynamic scripting type tool. So that's where this comes into is it's easier to do that where you're putting the script into a service request for a data a data connection of some sort depending on what you're needing to do, and you don't have to with Java from my standpoint, a CNC standpoint. If someone says, well, I've got some custom Java that I want to deploy for AIS, I kind of cringe because basically it's not that you can't do it. You can definitely set up the Java. You can put the classes in. It's just a more tedious. It's more work to put the jar file, get it on AIS. You've got to recycle it and so forth. Whereas with a Groovy script, it's you either can use a separate editor, like say Notepad++ or something like that, or any kind of code editor that you like to use. You can use Notepad, but you can set up your script there, you paste it in, you can test it right away because it's dynamic script, it executes right then. But some of the areas where it has been helpful, and again, some of these where we used to have to use Groovy, now they're doing it in Orchestrator Studios, which makes it a little bit nicer, is like if you have to do some calculations or maybe you have to go through the grid rows and assess it, and maybe you have to select maybe the first, the fifth, the seventh, or the 10th row out of 50 rows or something like that. You can use Groovy for that. The other one right now that we don't have is on export of CSVs. If you want to format that data or create a CSV output, the service request at this point does not have that feature. It can import, export JSON and XML, and it can import CSV, but it cannot export CSV natively in the studio. And again, Learn JDE, has quite a bit of information on some really good examples. It is open source, so if you really want to, you're a developer, you can go out to the Apache site, or you can get some really good YouTube videos. And then again, there's a nice doc ID that takes you through some of this. I'm not going to take you through this. This can be a whole afternoon or week of learning on your own. But if you do have some developers and you do have certain things like at ERP Suites, we have some of our applications that we create, the orchestrations that we create with our mobility product and our more to our scanning product, scannability. We use some Groovy scripts in those, again, to work with the data or to do certain things, like if we need to get certain media objects to do other type of activities. And another nice feature that's been there since Tools 922X is the orchestration scheduler. With the scheduler, think of it as kind of like it's similar to a cron scheduler. It's an open source called Quartz scheduler that they've embedded with AIS. And again, it started in 9224. They really enhanced in Tools 924 by adding an interface and ability to auto start the scheduled orchestrations or notifications that you want to do. So the reason for that is if you were wanting to do it before in the earlier tools releases like 923, you had to have your own either Postman or scripts or something. You had to have your own interface by using REST commands to do that. So I'm not saying you couldn't, but it wasn't as intuitive. So JD Edwards, again, Oracle's done a really nice job of giving you a nice interface there to be able to work with it. One of the areas, though, is there's also a piece called Scheduler Resilience. And again, this is a good doc idea on how to set it up. The main thing to remember about the scheduler is that by default, if you don't have resilience, it's just sitting in memory. So what that means is as long as that AIS instance with the scheduler enabled is running, the schedule will continue. If, let's say, AIS goes down, you just stop it and you bring it back up, it won't run any schedules. You either have to, if you're on 924, there's on that tools, you can set some things to auto start and start them up. But Otherwise, you would either have to use rest commands in that. The resilience gives you two capabilities. One is it allows you to store those scheduled jobs in a database sets of tables for all the different platforms. And the second one is if you decide you want redundant AIS servers to be running scheduled orchestrations, the main thing there is if you didn't have resilience, there is no common point of this. If you set it up and you have, let's say, two AIS instances, then each of them are going to run the same orchestrations that they're started if you use the commands, unless you have completely separate rest commands and you manage all that and everything else. With the resilience, you're getting a common database, so they're all looking at the same table, and they can come back and say, oh, I've got it. So if you take down one of your AIS instances, it doesn't work there. It doesn't affect it. So that's the main thing about that. But again, I've got some references there. The other thing about this is there is a quartz desk scheduler. I note it down here. You could do that. I mean, that's a full product. But if you don't like using that scheduler, you can use your own. I mean, again, with a curl command, you can have the Windows Task Scheduler on a server. You can use Linux cron, or even the AS400, as long as you add the POSIX curl command to your 400. We've had IBM job schedulers that can run these as well. So you do have quite a few different areas there. But if you don't have any kind of scheduler and you want to run these orchestrations notifications, again, in the 924, that's where I'd suggest you be to leverage this, but you can on the earlier ones. And again, here's a quick look at that, the AIS web interface here, where in this particular case, nothing started, but I can show it real quick. Let's do that. Let's do a jump out here. So here's the studio. So I'm not PowerPointing you to death. Now, I will say on this scheduler here, I've got quite a few jobs, so this may take a few seconds for this to load. But basically, when it initializes here, this is tools 9243. So I'm going out and talking to the AIS server. Here comes my list, and I've got a job. I've got a couple reports it runs, and they run every 15 minutes. And in this particular case here, just by clicking start or stop, that makes it easy. Again, in prior releases, I have to initiate a rest command to start or stop this. In this case, now they've added a table, and you can designate which ones you want to auto start if you stop the AIS instance, which is really nice. So you just check box here. This one, if I want to stop this, now that orchestration is no longer running every 15 minutes. And if I come over here real quick, I'll bring that up as well. But over on this particular side here, while I'm waiting for it to bring up my work list. There we go. But you can see here in the background, I've had it, that particular one, that orchestration was running 2 batch jobs. So I just had it do an R0006P, and we can see every 15 minutes it was executing. Just to give a quick little example that stuff actually does work. Another big one is the process recorder. Again, this came out in 9224, so you can see a lot of this functionality of Watershed Tools release is 9224 and later. This is really nice though because it allows you just to walk through. You could have the end user, business analyst, whoever, they can walk through the steps that they're doing, and the process recorder can capture that to create a service request, which you can then put within an orchestration. So it's really good for capturing the majority of the tasks, and just saves you some time instead of having to do that step by step within the studio itself. Overall, I'd say probably at least 3/4 to 80% of the time, we use the process recorder. That gets us our baseline of what we're wanting to do. And then we tweak through the studio any additional pieces or data that we're passing through, or if we want to, tweak it and maybe not have as many columns or grids, things like that, passing through it. One of the nice things about it is now in the 924, a lot of these are working where somewhere in some, I'll put lesser used use cases or lesser used applications. A couple of them were some big ones, but in 924, the vast majority of process recorder feature functionality is there. About the only one I'm aware of. I think these are they're on the runway down the point, but if you have some tree forms or parent-child grid, there's still some opportunities there. In some of the earlier releases, if you had mobile radio buttons as input, that was a bit of a challenge. It wouldn't take too many radio buttons or drop-down lists to have some, let's just say, some opportunities. That's been fixed though in 924. Grid icons, they've actually had features where you could actually have icons within the grid rows. 924 tools fixes that. So again, these are some of those things where I've talked about. Maybe you're on an earlier tools, you get to certain points where you're using certain applications and orchestrations, and you say, well, I wanted to do this. Well, here's a reason they fixed that in the later tools. Another one was being able to capture return values and pause resume all the way through. I've got a doc ID that explains that in a little bit more detail. Again, throughout the other features, in 9214, they added connectors, and again, a connector will let you go out and talk to other REST services or server manager. As a matter of fact, I'll get through this. I'll do a quick demo where we actually have an orchestration that talks to server manager, and it can reset the JAS caches. In 9234, we had one that helped a little bit with performance and flexibility, where put this in so that you could actually make a REST call to call one of the AIS services. Let's say, again, maybe you had to do something with media objects or something of that nature. You could, or again, you can do some of these things now in the Orchestrator Studio, but you can call other AIS calls with a local REST, and that way it doesn't open up a second AIS session. Technically, again, you could just say AIS is an external REST call and not use local, but that'll double up your sessions. And if you did something iteratively, you might open up more sessions that way, whereas the local will just use your actual session there. And then database connectors, that was really nice, where you can have JDBC connections out to, let's say, you had an Oracle or other SQL Server database that's not JD Edwards. FTP is another really nice one. If you set up an FTP server, you could get to maybe a print queue or certain folders where some data that you want to store. You've got the ability to do, in these later releases, you can invoke orchestrations from table or event rules. And a couple examples of the apps. The business function is B98org, or there's a test harness app, P98org, that you can use. There's also the ability to launch UBEs, and you can even override the data selection, sequencing, and processing options. So in effect, it's similar to run UBE XML for a user submitting a batch. Again, we talked about the CSV connectors. You can import within Studio and all that. And again, there's Oracle support and documentation, Learn JDE. Out on our ERP Suites website, we even have some blogs about some of the import exports and some of the things you can do there. The health monitor, this is one of my favorites. I showed it to you briefly. I've got a little demo of it, but this is really nice in that you can bring it up here through the My Work List, which is an E1 page, and you do the tools for 923. You download this UDO, and you can see some things. It's very useful to see how your orchestrations are running, if they fail or so forth. You can also, just from FastPath or put this on a composed page, use the P980060X external app and bring it up directly. So that part is really nice there. this the health monitor you set up in AIS. It does take some CNC, a little bit of setup, but it's really nice to have. So what are some of the tips? Um, within this, Oracle's done a really good job, in my opinion, of because the REST JSON interface, even if you put it out to the internet, you really don't have a lot of JavaScript. So you're not exposing your JAS HTML instance. You're exposing just that REST and the APIs that you allow to be there. There is a good doc ID that takes you through a little bit of that, but for the security conscience, you can look at that. Definitely recommend, though, obviously, nowadays, I did put this down here, but from a CNC standpoint, if it's external facing, always, 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 be using SSL with some of the highest levels of encryption, that you can use there. But even internally, maybe your sites go ahead, if you have a load balancer or something, you'll do SSL offloading, or you just have people use SSL there to encrypt that data that's going back and forth. Again, view security. This depends on how you like to do your security, but for a number of customers, what we'll do is control everything at the orchestration level and have the other UDO objects that orchestrations utilize, like service requests or rules and so forth. We'll allow security on those so that you don't have to define individual security by role, by individual objects. You can lock down either way you like to. This is a matter of preference and how much you want to do on your security maintenance. But for some customers, we'll just lock things down at the orchestration level to only allow a certain user a certain role, and then you might have certain roles or start public for service requests and some of the other UDO associated objects. Again, lots of different clients. You can use about whatever you want, but the Orchestrator client, SoapUI, Postman, Curl, are all really good tools. The browsers also, Firefox has a built-in REST client that you can use there. And there's some good docs on how to use SoapUI or Postman token requests. And again, there's a lot of reference examples down here. Another link for you to give you plenty of things to think about. There's a lot of good documentation about the different security methods. So again, you can use username, password, which you can put in the body. You can do basic authentication, which is where you're putting it more into the authentication header. Some things though, like if you want to do OAuth 2, AIS can make an outbound. But if you want inbound OAuth 2 or something of that nature, you're going to have some type of security package like OAM or some other security provider to help with that. And again, some of the things about basic authentication, gets and posts. Generally, you're going to post with a body of information instead of putting it up in the URL command, which is what a get essentially is. But you can. Get, typically though, it's going to be good for certain things, like if you want the default configuration or you want to discover what orchestrations are there, you'll use that method. And otherwise you can post, and that's what the majority of these are. And you can either post and be stateless, which is just get in, do it, and come back, or if you got sessions where you want to make continuous requests, you'll want to have state where you get a token, you get the information you need. Maybe you make 2, 3, 4 orchestration calls, maybe 10, who knows, like a mobility app or things like that. So you'll maintain that session, and then when it's ready to log out, it'll log out the token itself. A couple other things to think about. If you have large orchestrations, hundreds of thousands of rows, you might have to increase the client's HTTP timeout. A lot of them are 60 seconds. Another thing is if you're grabbing a lot of rows in AIS, or for the JAS service, the WebSphere WebLogic, you probably will have to. You'll have to do the max parameter request. You'll have to increase that. So a lot of times we'll have these up at 500,000. Again, another thing just to be aware of. In Tools 9233, they introduced the paging features, which is really nice, so that you don't overwhelm that JAS server by, say, pull back 20,000 rows and use up a lot of memory. You can say, give me 1,000 at a time, or limit it to 1,000 rows. You have more flexibility there. Again, multiple times in a row, if you're doing orchestrations, you may want to have a token request to reuse the session. Gives you better performance. And then there's also some self-documentation with the Swagger Open API docs. So I know I'm going through these a little fast here, but the another tip though that just recently saw is we're using the chord scheduler. That's another reason why I keep talking about maybe using 924 before you attempt to use the AIS scheduler. This doc ID talks about basically recommending you go up to 924 because there are certain situations with 922X and 923X, they're at what we call the terminal status. There's no more fixes coming for those tools. And there's a couple situations where you may have a scheduled orchestration. Let's say you want it to run every hour. The first one runs, but then sometimes you'll get a null pointer exception and the subsequent ones don't run. So it depends on your situation, but you may run into that limitation. So again, the recommendation in the stock ID is to update to a newer tools. It doesn't sound like there's any fix for those at these older tools levels. Another exciting one from our development side is the ability to call business functions and named event rules directly. Again, for us and our scannability product for mobile scanning, things of that nature, sometimes we don't need to use an entire application. We just need to use a business function to get some information. So again, it's not something not all customers are going to use, but for developers and people comfortable with the business functions NER, there are some use cases where that has that. And recently, again, just this year, 9243 has debugging features now. It helps us troubleshoot as these orchestrations get larger and so forth. Another quick one is the orchestration monitor. If you set the exceptions for the error level or for the warning level, you say, I want the monitor to log those. It does, currently it changes the HTTP response from a 200 to a 500 level so that it logs it as an exception. Depending on your REST client, though, some of them may or may not like that. So again, they've changed the formatting so that when you do have an exception, the JSON format in 9242, I believe, is more consistent with the regular 200 response. But again, these are just some little things, some tidbits to be aware of. So in summary, I'm not going to have time for my demos. I apologize, but the Studio provides an easier method, again, to expose those E1 applications. Definitely investigate the uses. Strongly suggest if you're new to Studio, try to get up to 924. A lot of advantages to having it there. Again, depending on what you're trying to do as you grow your notification processes, or if you're using a lot more orchestrations, your architecture might have to be tweaked. You might have to have more instances or spread out the workload. Again, calling orchestrations from event rules, you got functions, you get triggers, form extensions. You've got all kinds of different ways of getting access to these orchestrations. So, again, a form extension is a nice way of on the glass of calling an orchestration and doing certain activities there. And we talked about notifications, and then again, the additional feature in 924X for the scheduler. So I'm go ahead, Taryn. We've got about 5 minutes. Let's go ahead and open it up for questions. I apologize for not. I kind of showed screenshots of these. I just didn't show the reset feature or the pick slip.
Okay, so we do have a few questions that came in. So if anyone else does have any questions, please put those into the question drop-down box. So I'll go ahead with the first. So if there are multiple AIS servers in production, where does Orchestrator Scheduler run? Should we run Scheduler on each AIS instance?
Basically, like I said, that's up to you. We've got some customers where they have 6 AIS instances, and at this point they didn't want resiliency, So what we have is we have mobile AIS servers, but the scheduler is only on their tools 92, I think they're 9242. At that point, we're only running it on one particular server. So for them, that works well. Now, if they start increasing volume where they have more schedule and they want the resiliency, we've talked about that in the architecture of going ahead and adding the schedule resiliency and then doing it across mobile machines. But for a lot of this, like I said, they're running thousands of orchestrations. So even with thousands, we've just sized the AIS instance to handle that, and we've not had any issues there by just using the one.
Okay, thank you. And our next question is, should externally sourced business-to-business calls be processed through a separate AIS server from internally sourced calls?
That comes down to some of your network security and infrastructure. Typically, I like to have for the external, I like to have a different instance. Do you have to? No, technically you don't. But again, it really depends on how if you're making outbound or you're allowing inbound. If it's just going outbound, like you're connecting out, let's say you connect to UPS or FedEx or something like that, those SSL calls, you'd be fine to have any of them do it if you want to. But if you've got inbound, let's say you're doing mobility or you're publishing some of your APIs and you've got some vendors, that usually it's kind of like a DMZ concept, is you're really just not doing a DMZ, but have it a separate servant instance. So I guess I'm saying is that there's not one right answer. You have to kind of take it into what are some of your network and the standards you have there, what's your volume and so forth. But you can go either way. It just depends on what your requirements and needs are.
Okay, thank you. And that is the last question that we had. I do have a few announcements before we wrap up. So just a reminder to go to our virtual exhibit hours that are today starting at 3:45 Eastern to 5 o'clock Eastern time. So we do have a lot of prizes over there, including Amazon gift cards, Ring doorbells, and a lot more. So to be eligible to win, go to the mobile app and the online planner and go to the exhibitor section, and there you can chat with solution providers. There's demos, you can download collateral and more. So the more you engage within that, the higher your chances are of winning a prize. So be sure to go and check that out. So thanks again, Frank, for coming and speaking with everyone today. We really appreciate it.
Thank you, everybody. Have a great day.